Masechet Baba Kama Daf Kof Gimel. We saw in the previous daf a machloket between Rabbi Yochanan interpreting Rabbi Yehuda, who says that if an agent goes and buys wheat on behalf of the sender from a seller of the wheat, even if the seller doesn't know that this is an agent getting it on someone else's behalf, nevertheless, it can be transferred, it can be acquired on behalf of the sender. So the seller does not need to know about it from the seller's perspective. That's going to this guy, but that's okay. It can still be transferred. Whereas the rabbis from Eretz Yisrael says that they mocked Rabbi Yochanan for saying that because those sages from Eretz Yisrael think that one cannot acquire for someone else unless the seller knows that he is doing so. You need the intention of the seller. The seller is half the party of doing the transfer, and so it's not going to get transferred without the seller agreeing to that. And so the seller, if he thinks he's giving it to this guy immediate here, the agent, then it will go to the agent. There's no way for it to go to the sender if the seller himself does not have that intention. So you need the seller to know who it's going to. Now we're going to bring a challenge to, attempted challenge to the rabbis from Eretz Yisrael. Tano Rabbanan, haloker sadeh b'shem chavero en kofin oto limkor, v'im amar lo almenat kofin oto limkor. The wording of this braita is a bit cryptic, and we're going to bring two explanations of it. But basically, you have a buyer, an agent, who's buying it, he says, for his friend. Now, he's not really buying it for his friend. He just says that he's buying it for his friend, and he names an important person. For example, the Resh Galuta, the Exilarch, the head of the Jewish community in Bavel. He's doing this in order to protect himself against protesters. Because if someone protests, says, oh no, I have a lien, it's mine, whatever reason that they protest, if it's the Resh Galuta buying it, then they're not going to protest. So this guy, even though Resh Galuta has nothing to do with it, he says to the seller, I'm buying it on behalf of my friend, of someone else. So we do not force him to sell it. We'll see who it's talking about. However, if the buyer in the beginning says, on condition that he will sell it to me, we have to do some kind of second sale or second deed so that the actual buyer can prove it's his, then we do force him. Okay, the pronouns who is talking about, that's what we're going to discuss right now. That we're going to have two interpretations. Here's interpretation number one. Mai ka'amar, amar Rav Sheshat, hachi ka'amar, haloker sadeh mechavero b'shem resh galuta, en kofin oto resh galuta limkor. V'im amar almenat kofin et resh galuta limkor. So we're filling in the pronouns here. If a buyer buys a field from his friend, and he tells the seller, I am buying it not for myself. I'm an agent. I'm buying it on behalf of the Resh Galuta. But this is all fake. He's buying it for himself. He's only saying that he's buying it from Resh Galuta, so everybody will think that, and nobody will protest. But here's the thing. Now he gets a deed of sale from the seller that says, here, I'm selling this to the Resh Galuta. Now this doesn't help the buyer, because the buyer needs a deed for himself, so that in the future, he will have the deed. So he needs the Resh Galuta to go and write a second deed to say, oh, it's not mine, it belongs to this guy, the buyer. And now we cannot force the Resh Galuta to write such a deed, right? Because Resh Galuta, what do I have to do with it? I don't want to. However, when the buyer buys it from the seller, he says, on condition that the Resh Galuta will provide documentation to me that it's really mine. In this case, I guess the seller knows that this is a ruse, but that's okay. The idea is that it's okay if the seller knows, because the seller is willing to sell it. The buyer just wants a deed that says, this belongs to Resh Galuta. I didn't buy it for myself, I bought it on behalf of Resh Galuta. So if in the beginning, the buyer says, I'm buying this on condition that I get another deed that says my name on it, then the court can force the Resh Galuta, says, listen, this says your name on it, but he bought this on condition that he would get a second deed, so you have to go write a second deed to say, it's actually not mine, it belongs to the buyer. That's how we're interpreting, that's what Rav Sheshet is interpreting this case. Amar mor haloker sadeh b'shem resh galuta en kofin oto resh galuta limkor. Now we're just re-quoting the beginning of it, that we do not force the resh galuta to write a second deed if it was not said so explicitly. Mikelal de mikna kanyale. But we can learn from this that the sale is a valid sale to the buyer. It doesn't go to resh galuta because nobody had in mind that the resh galuta would get it. The buyer wanted it for himself. And here's the thing. The seller thought that it's going to the resh galuta. Even though the seller thought that it's going to resh galuta, doesn't matter. Since the buyer had different intention, the buyer intended to acquire it for himself, the sale works. This seems to be a proof against the rabbis of Israel. Lema peliga amri pechi mi hodi ole bal chitin shekne chitin lebal habayit. The sages from Israel said, if the seller of the wheat thinks that they're giving it to this guy, it can't possibly go to another guy. In that case, the sellers of the wheat thought it was going to the agent here, and therefore it cannot go to the sender somewhere else. In this case, the roles are flipped, but it's the same principle. How is it possible that if the buyer presents himself as an agent and says, it's not going to me, it's going to resh galuta, that's what he sells. So therefore the seller has in mind, when he transfers the land, that it should transfer to the resh galuta. So then it should only be able to go to resh galuta. There's no mechanism, according to the sages of Israel, if the seller doesn't know it's going to the buyer, doesn't think it's going to the buyer, then it can't go to the buyer. But here, the implication of this interpretation is that although the resh galuta does not have to write a second deed, but the land is in fact owned by the buyer. So is this a good challenge to the sages of Israel? Not necessarily, because this could be talking about, even in the Resha, could be talking about a case where the buyer did inform the seller and the witnesses, listen, secretly, I'm buying this for myself, right? So I want you to have in mind to give it to me. And he tells the witnesses to the transaction the same. But he just says, listen, write in the contract that's going to resh galuta so that I can walk out and protest or say, oh, for resh galuta. That's the case. So therefore, there's no challenge to B'nei Ma'arava from this case. Okay, so now there's no challenge at all to B'nei Ma'arava, but now we're going to challenge the very interpretation of the Shashat on its own grounds. The Sefer makes no sense, just logically, because if the buyer says, I will buy it for this land from you on condition that the Resh Galuta writes me a deed that it's really mine. Well, why? How can we force Resh Galuta to do that? Resh Galuta says, I don't want your honor, I don't want your disgrace. In other words, don't get me involved. Although you're honoring me to say, oh, everyone's scared of me, right? Like, oh, see, right, it increases my honor. But I don't want your disgrace. I have to get involved. Now, everybody who buys land is going to write Resh Galuta, and they're all going to be at my door asking, oh, can you write me a second deed? I don't want to deal with it. Leave me alone. So there's no way we can force the Resh Galuta to write something that he never agreed to. So this interpretation cannot be. Ela amar Abaye, hachi aka'amar, halokech sadeh b'shem chavero, resh galuta, en kofin eta mocher limkor zimna achariti. V'yamar lo amenat, kofin eta mocher limkor. Abaye says, new interpretation, switching the identification of one of the pronouns in this baraita. And it means like this. The buyer says to the seller, I want you to sell it to me, and I'm buying it on behalf of the Resh Galuta. If he does that, we do not force the seller to write another deed. In other words, he's going to do one transaction. This is write down Resh Galuta in here. And he shows everybody, Resh Galuta bought it. See, no one protests. Then he goes back to the seller and says, listen, can you write me a second deed? Because really I bought it for myself. No, so we don't force the seller. The seller doesn't want to write multiple deeds, extra paperwork. He's putting his name on contradictory deeds. It makes him look funny. He doesn't want to, so we can't force him. Unless the buyer says, I'll buy it on condition that right now you write that I'm buying it for the Resh Galuta. But afterwards, I want you to write a second deed that I'm the real owner. If he said on condition, he said that up front, then the seller has to write a second deed. Good. So now we're going to quote the lines from this interpretation and analyze them. Amar Mor. הלוקח שדה בשם חברו אין כופינות את המוכר למכור זמנה אחריתה פשיטה. The first part of the case, that the buyer, if he didn't stipulate so originally, cannot force the seller to write a second deed. Isn't that obvious? Right? Obviously, you can't force him. They never agreed to such a thing. How can you even think that you would force the seller to have to write another deed? And the answer is, עבדי לך בהדאהוז דזבנט לבשמה ויכתוב לך שטרח חרינה. So here's what I might have thought. The buyer can tell the seller, listen, you knew that I was buying it for myself, even though I came and told you, I'm buying this for Resh Galuta. I guess this was, done often. So you knew that I was just saying that I didn't mean it. And I was just doing it for my own protection. So that's why I desire to say it was Resh Galuta. And I'm not going to give you money for nothing. I'm just paying and then not get anything myself. So rather, I know and you know, and I know that you know, that knew that it was my intention that you would write another deed for me. And therefore, I might have thought that even though they didn't stipulate it explicitly, it was implicit and the seller knew that and therefore should have to write. Therefore, it teaches us not so. The seller can say, I did the matter for you with the purchaser's name in mind. You said Resh Galuta. I did what you said literally. I don't have to go read your mind to say, oh, maybe you're not really writing it for Resh Galuta. I did what you asked me explicitly, and so then I'm done with this deal. I don't have to write anything else. That's what it's coming to teach. That's the Kiddush. Now, we quote the second part. If he says on condition, I want to buy this from you on condition that right now you write for Resh Galuta, and then you write a second deed that has my name on it. Then we do force the seller to write it. That's also obvious. If you said a condition, obviously he has to fulfill the condition. מהו דתמה מסי אמר לאמינא שטרה מהאח דקה שקלת בשמה כאמרת כמשמע לן דאמר לאחי תרחב אמרי להו לאדים כמך דמינך הוא דקה בעינה. We're talking about a case not where the buyer explicitly spoke to the seller directly and said, on condition that you write me a second deed. Then yes, obviously he would have to. But rather we're talking about a case where the buyer turned to the witnesses who were there to witness this transaction, and he told the witnesses, you can see that I'm going to need another document. So he's telling the witnesses with intention that the seller is overhearing that, he's also there, and then the seller would have an idea. He did say it explicitly. He just didn't say it explicitly to the seller. He said it to the witnesses, I will need another document. So I might have thought that the seller can say, I thought when you told the witnesses I'm going to need another document, what you meant is that you're going to need another document from the Resh Galuta that you acquired, you acquired it in his name. I didn't know that you meant that you would need me to write a second document. So I might have thought he could say no. Therefore, the Braita teaches not so, that the buyer could say, why do you think I bothered telling the witnesses in front of you? I was giving more than a hint, right? I was actually saying explicitly without having to totally make it 100% and tell you directly, I need another document. He wanted to be a little subtle because after all, he's using this ruse for people to think that it's he's buying it on behalf of the Resh Galuta. So not to totally undermine his ruse, he's not saying it directly to the seller, but he says to the witnesses, he says, why do you think I told the witnesses in front of you that I need another deed? It's obviously it's so that you could get the hint that you're going to need to write a second deed. So this Baraita comes to teach that indeed so. If he says in front of the witnesses, I'm going to need another deed, then the seller, that's like saying on condition to the seller, and then the seller does have to write another deed with the buyer's name on it. Next, we cite a potential proof for the rabbis of the West from Medinat Yisrael from the following story. Rav Kahana Yehav Zuzeh Akitana. Rav Kahana gave money to someone to buy flax. Go buy flax for me. So the guy went, he bought flax, but that buyer, the agent, kept it in his possession and did not transfer it to Rav Kahana. Lesof Aikar Kitana. In the meantime, the price of flax went up. Zabene marvate dechitana. And so that agent sold the flax on behalf of Rav Kahana. So this is great. Rav Kahana made a profit now. He never took physical possession of it, but he had bought it. It was sitting there, went up, sold it. Good. Rav Kahana went to ask a halachic question to his teacher Rav. He says, what do you think? Can I go take the money? The problem is, it may seem like ribit, interest, because he gave him, let's say he gave him $100, and he bought the flax, and now the price went up to $150. So now he gave $100, and after some time, he's going back and taking $150 from this guy. Looks like he lent him money on interest. Amar le ikaza beni amri, ikaza beni amri, hai kitana dechanahu zil shekol vila latishkol. Rav says depends. If at the time that this guy, the buyer, bought the flax, he said, this is flax of kahana, right? If he told that seller, I'm buying this flax for kahana, then it's clear that to everyone that in fact goes to kahana, including from the seller's point of view, which is really important. The seller knows it's going to Rav Kahana, so it really does go to Rav Kahana, and therefore the Rav Kahana owned the flax. And so then there's nothing wrong with then it being sold. A person's allowed to make money on merchandise that he buys and then goes up in price and sells. That's buying and selling is all about. Then that's fine. But if not, if the buyer did not, he went and bought it, and the seller, for all he knows, is selling it to that agent himself, then how's anybody to know that it's yours and maybe never transferred to you in the first place? You give 100, take 150, then it's a problem. That would appear to be a loan with interest. Okay, that's the story. Let's analyze. Kiman, kibne ma'aravad, amre, mihoti ole bal chitin, shek nechitin, lebal ma'ot. Who does this follow? It seems like Rav is following the opinion of the rabbis from Medinat Yisrael who say, who told the seller of wheat that this guy is an agent and buying it on behalf of the sender. If the seller doesn't know that it's going to someone else, then it cannot go to someone else. And here also, if the seller knows that it's going to Rav Kahana, then it goes to Rav Kahana, and then it's a good sale. But if he doesn't know, even if the agent had it in mind, nevertheless, it does not transfer to Rav Kahana, and therefore it looks like interest. So this seems to support those sages from Eretz Yisrael. But we reject this proof. Atu mi yahib Rav Kahana ba v'shakil temane ki tana memela hu da'ikar migzal gazlu utnan kol hagazlanim mishalamin kishat hagezela. It could very well be that this is a valid sale, even though the seller didn't know who's getting it. Nevertheless, he's acting as an agent. And in this case, why should there be a problem? Did Rav Kahana give 4 and take 8 in return? In which case, if it was just a loan, then it would be prohibited? No, he didn't do that. Rather, he bought flax, and the flax by itself, the price went up. And then when this agent sold it, he sold something that was not his. He was not authorized to sell it. Rav Kahana never told him to sell it. And therefore, by selling something that was not his, that agent is a robber. And the Mishnah says that a robber has to pay for what he stole at the time of the robbery. Well, he sold it. The time of selling it is the act of robbery. And so therefore, we can consider him simply a robber. He bought it on behalf of Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana owns the flax. The agent sold it without permission, which is in effect stealing it. So he has to pay back for what he stole. What did he steal? He stole the higher value worth of flax. And so there's no problem. There's no problem here either way. So even though we rejected this, we still have to explain why did Rav say it would be prohibited. Unless he said that I'm buying it for Rav Kahana. Amre hatam amana havai vela mashche Rav Kahana lechitana Rav el tamed amarav osin amana beperot ve'en osin amana bedamim. In that case, it was just a buy on trust. In other words, Rav Kahana gave the guy $100. The guy did not actually buy flax at that time, but rather it was put on trust that, listen, you will buy flax in the future at this price. It's kind of like buying a future, an option to buy flax at a future time at the current rate. And therefore, since the agent did not actually buy any flax at that time, Rav Kana did not pull the flax, did not acquire anything. So this is more problematic because this follows what Rav says in general, where if you do an arrangement on trust, meaning an option to buy in the future at the current price, if you do that with produce, then it's fine. Meaning, if I would give you $100 to say, listen, I want to buy $100 worth of apples at the current market price, but I don't want it now. I want it next month. But I want to lock in the current price, and then in a month you go and buy it, even if it ends up being more money, all right? You take that loss, and you deliver me the apples. That's okay, as long as I'm getting the actual apples. Even though you're not getting them now and you're paying a higher price, that's okay. Now, why would you do that? Well, because you want the money now and you're going to use it for your business and all that, and you're taking a risk because it could go down and still you could make money that way. So that's permitted, but you cannot do an arrangement like that if the apples aren't actually getting delivered. You can't say, listen, here's $100 for the price now, and then in a month from now, pay me the amount of the same amount of apples and pay me in money. That's a problem because that looks like collecting interest, and that's what was going on at this time. In this case, he was going to get back the money, not the actual produce, and so that's why I said, well, then you cannot take the money unless he actually bought the apples and delivered the apples themselves. All right, next Mishnah. הגוזל את חברו שווה פרוטה ונשבע לו, יוליכנו אחריו למדי. לא ייתן, לא לבנו ולא לשלוחו, אבל נותן לשליח בית דין, ואם מת יחזיר ליורשיו. Someone steals from someone else a money or an item that's worth at least a peruta or more. This is going to be a main principle here. Something less than a peruta is considered worthless. There's no, you can't calculate that value. The reason is because this is the smallest denomination. It's like a penny. And so if it's smaller than a peruta, it's not payable, and therefore we consider it insignificant. All right, so someone steals at least a peruta and swears falsely that he does not owe it. Then, in the end, in order to make teshuvah, since he not only stole or denied a claim and swore, he's going to have to add a fifth and bring korban. Okay, now this guy, because he did this, he has to return and give the payment, and even if the person he stole from, the victim, lives far away in Madai, and let's say he stole a $1, right? It's more than a piruta. He stole $1, and it's going to cost him $100 to travel to Madai. Nevertheless, that's the robber's responsibility. You stole, you have to pay it back, and you have to spend $100 in order to return $1. And it's not sufficient to return it to the victim's son or to a messenger. You have to return it to the victim himself. Now, there is one leniency. You can give it to an agent of the Bet Din. The Bet Din can represent the person, and that way that'll get him off the hook, and hopefully make it easier for him to make teshuvah, because otherwise he might not want to spend so much money to go return $1. If the victim dies, then the robber, in order to make restitution, pays the heirs of the victim. Mishnah continues, Natano et hakeren velo natano et hachomesh, machalo al hakeren velo machalo al hachomesh, machalo al ze ve'al ze chutz mipachot mishave peruta bakeren, eno sarich lelech acharav. If the robber stole money and then he stole $100 and lied about it and swore. And he paid back the $100 but didn't pay back the extra fifth, which would be the extra $25. Or the victim said, you know what, I forgive you on the principal on the $100, but he didn't forgive him on the 25. That 25 also goes to the victim. Or if the victim said, you don't have to pay anything except for one peruta, 1 cent of the principal that you stole. in all less than a peruta of the principal that you stole, then the robber, although he is required to pay that whatever he didn't yet pay, but he doesn't have to go travel after and find him. So this law of going to travel far away, even at whatever expense, only applies to the principal amount and not to the surcharge. So therefore, if he had paid the principal amount, or it was forgiven, or it was all forgiven except for less than the peruta, anything less than peruta is not significant, and therefore it's the same as the entire amount being forgiven. So he doesn't have to travel just to pay the surcharge. However, natano atachomesh v'lo natano atakeden, machalo l'chosha machalo ataket ala keden, machalo al ze v'al ze chus mishave peruta bekeden, sarich lelech acharav. If the robber paid the surcharge, the 25. I'm saying 25, even though a fifth of 100 is 20, because it's the fifth of the total amount, it will be surcharge. So it ends up being a quarter. So if he paid the 25, but not the 100, or the victim said, you don't have to pay the surcharge, I forego my right to that, but he did not forego the right to collect the principal, or if he forgave all of it except for one whole peruta of the keren, then since he still owes at least one peruta of the principal amount, the robber has to go and spend any money he needs to travel to give it to him in his hand directly. Natano at hakeden v'nishma lo al hachomesh, hadezem mishalem chomesh al chomesh ad sheyitma'et hakeden mishaveh peruta. Here we have a recursive function. If he paid the principal and he swore and he swore only on the surcharge. In other words, he stole 100. And he swore that, no, I don't owe you 100. Okay, turns out he was lying, so now he's going to have to pay 125. He pays the 100, but he claims that he already paid the 25. But that's a false claim, and he swore about it. So now he just implicated himself again, so he has to pay now a quarter of that 25. He has to add a surcharge, 25 plus 20 plus a quarter of 25. So he's liable to that. Let's say he pays the 25, but then lies about the surcharge on the 25 and says, I paid that to you already. But turns out he was lying. So then he's going to have to pay a quarter of a 16th of 25. But let's say he lies about that also and says, I paid the surcharge on that, but he pays the principal. So you're going to keep going, and he'll have to keep on adding a fifth surcharge until the surcharge is less than a peruta. Once it ends up being less than a peruta, after a few rounds of this, then it's considered insignificant, and he doesn't have to do anything at all. וכן בפיקדון שנאמר, או בפיקדון, או בתשומת יד, או בגזל, או עשק את חמיתו, או מסע אבדה וכיחש בה, ונשבע על שקר, הרי זה משלם קרן וחומש ואשם. And this is true not only if you steal, but also for a deposit. If he gives him something to watch for him, and then he says, no, I don't have it, but he's lying. As the pasuk says, that this law applies for a deposit, a pledge, a robbery, exploited someone else, found something that was lost and denied that he found it, and he swears falsely. Then he has to pay back and add a fifth to it, and he also has to bring an asham offering. All right, that's the Mishnah, and now we analyze nishpat lo in, lo nishpat lo la. One has to pay back in his hand directly only if he stole and swore. But let's say he just stole but didn't swear falsely about it. Then he does not have to pay back in his hand. He can just deposit it, give it to an agent, and that's it. He fulfilled his obligation. Maneh. So who would be the author of this Mishnah, assuming that this implication? Maneh lo Rabbi Tarfon velo Rabbi Akiba. It seems that it can't be anybody, any of these two Tanaim. And here's their machloket, the Tanya. Gazal echad mechamisha ve'no yodeam eze mehen. Chol echad omer oti gazal. Someone steals from one of 5 people, but he doesn't know who he stole from. I don't know, he went and took some money out of someone's pocket, and he has the money, but it was dark, whatever. He pickpocketed someone, but he doesn't actually see the face of who he pickpocketed, but there were 5 people in the room, so it was one of them. And each of the other 5 people say he stole from me. So they all claim that they are the victims. Now, how is this robber going to make restitution? So, Maniach Gezela Benehem Wistalek Bitarfon. Bitarfon says, listen, I pickpocketed one of you for $20. Here's the $20. He puts it in the middle of the room and he leaves. He fulfilled his obligation. He stole $20 from someone and he puts it there, and they'll have to figure out who is the real owner. They'll fight it out. They'll take it to court, and so that's all he has to do. Rabbi Akiva omer, lo zo derech mosiato mida'avera. Ad sheyishlem gezerah l'chol echad ve'echad. Rabbi Akiva says that's not sufficient to undo his sin. Rather, he has to pay each and every claimant. If the robber doesn't know who he stole from, then he has to pay back everyone who is claiming that they are the victim. Now, now that we know the machloket, let's see who could possibly be the author of our Mishnah. Either be Tarfon. See, in this baraita, there's no distinction between if he swore falsely or didn't swear falsely. That's why nobody can be the author. Either be Tarfon afagav de ishteba amar maniach gezela benhem umistalek. If it's the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, since he made no distinction between if he didn't swear or swore, sounds like even if he swore falsely and say I didn't steal anything, but then it ends up admitting that it was him, that still all he has to do is deposit the $20 and leave. So he doesn't have to run after him and go to Madai and make sure he puts it in his hand. He could just leave it there. So it can't be to be Tarfon. According to Akiva, there's no distinction between swearing or not. So even if he doesn't swear, he has to go and give it in the hand of each and every person. But our Mishnah said that you only have to go to Madai if you swore falsely also, then you have to put it in his hand. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to, and you could just leave it there. But Rabbi Akiva says you have to put in each one's hand, even without a swear. So, who is the author? And the answer is the Olam Rabbi Akiva hi. V'chi amar Rabbi Akiva she'yishlem gezela lochel echad ve'echad hechad ishtebahu dekamar mai ta'ama de'amar kera lasher hu lo yitenenu beyom ashmato. So, in fact, it could be Rabbi Akiva. And when Rabbi Akiva says that you have to pay each and every person, each and every one, actually, it's only a case where he did take an oath, and that's our Mishnah was talking about a case where he stole and swore, and that's why he has to give it. He has to go and give it in the hands of each and every person. What's the source of Rabbi Akiva? Because the pasuk in the context of this Asham Gezelot says, to him who it appertains, he give it on the day of his being guilty. Lasher hu lo itenena. He has to give it directly to the person who he stole it from, and that means both that he'll have to travel far to go give it to him directly, and if he doesn't know who it is, he'll have to pay each and every person. But in fact, Rabbi Akiva thinks that's only if he swore. V'Rabbi Tarfon. Well, what's Rabbi Tarfon? What's he going to do with this pasuk? Afagav dishteba abud rabbanan takanta. He agrees that in essence, the letter of the law is what the pasuk says, that you'd have to give it to him directly. But Rabbi Tarfon thinks that even if he swore, the rabbis made a special enactment as a leniency to help the robber make teshubah. Detanya. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Sadok Omer Takana Gedola Itkinu She'im Haytai Hosa'a Yetera LaKeren Meshalem Keren Vechomesh LeBetin Umebi Ashamo Mitkaper Lo. Sources of Braita, according to Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Sadok, that the rabbis made a great enactment that if someone stole and swore, and really, therefore, according to the pasuk, he has to hand it directly to the victim. But if the expenses for the trip are going to be more than the principal, sometimes, like a bank or phone company has to pay you 5 cents. They end up spending $1 on the stamp to send you a check for 5 cents, right? So if the expenses are more than the principal that he has to pay, then the rabbi said, no one's going to want to make a trip like that, and then they're not going to make teshuvah. So you know what? We'll make an enactment that you just have to pay the principal and the surcharge to a bet din, and then you can bring your asham sacrifice, and you can get atonement, and eventually the bet din will get the money to the victim one way or another. So Rabbi Tarfon is following that takana, and that's why he says it's just like you don't have to go travel far because that would be a big expense. It would be the same thing in this case. If you don't know who you stole from, you're going to have to pay 5 times the amount that you stole. No one's going to make teshuvah. So the rabbis here, same takana. Just deposit the money in Betin, according to this, and let the other 5 people come and find out who is the actual victim. And so this is a special leniency. V'Rabbi Akiva, ki avud Rabbanan takada echad yada leman gazle, de'kam hada lemamona lemare, gazal echad mechamisha, de'la yada leman gazale, de'la hada mamona lemare, la avud Rabbanan takanta. Rabbi Akiva doesn't agree with that there was such an enactment. He says, yes, I agree that the rabbis made an enactment only where the robber knows who the victim is. And so the money is definitely getting to the victim. He's depositing in court because that way he doesn't have to travel so far. But if he stole from 5 different people and he doesn't know who the victim is, where the deposit that he's putting there, $20, is not necessarily going to get to the victim. So the rabbis did not say a takana that you could pay once and who knows if the right person is going to get it. No, the rabbis didn't go that far. It's much easier to make a smaller takana to say, listen, don't have to put it in his hand, deposit it somewhere and it'll get to him. But here the rabbi's takana did not extend also to the case where you don't know who the victim is. Mativ Rav Huna bar Yehuda Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Lo nichleku Rabbi Tarfon v'Rabbi Akiva al shelakach echad mechamisha ve'eno yodea me'eze hem mehen lakach shemeniach demeh mikach benehem umistalek. על מה נחלקו שגזל אחד מחמישה בני אדם ואינו יודע מאיזה מהן גזל, שרבי טרפון אומר מניח דמי גזלה ביניהם מסתלק, ורבי עקיבא אומר אין לא תקנה עד שישלם גזלה לכל אחד ואחד. Rav Huna, the son of Yehuda, now rejects the identification of our Mishnah with Rabbi Akiva because that identification assumed that the Braita that presented their machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon was only where they swore. However, now we're going to see a different version of that very Braita in which you'll see it's evident that it doesn't matter if they swear or not. Because he says that in this version of the Braita, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, says that Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva agree that if someone bought an item from one of 5 sellers, but he doesn't remember who the seller is and he didn't pay for it yet, there they all agree that he can just take the money that he owes for buying it and put it between them and leaves. Says, listen, I bought it from one of you, here's the purchase price and I'm leaving. However, where do they disagree? If he stole from one of 5 people and doesn't know who he stole from, that's where Rabbi Tarfon says that he puts the money in the middle and leaves, and Rabbi Akiva says no, he has to pay each and every person. That's this version of the Braita. Now, mali lakach, mali gazal. If you think that this Braita, as we said before, is only where he swears, well then why would there be a distinction between the buyer who owes money and the robber, right? Because the law of swearing falsely applies anytime you owe someone money for whatever reason, whether it be a purchase or a lost item or something that you robbed, and you swear falsely that you don't owe, then the law is the same for all those cases. And therefore, if it's a case where he swore, then it would not make any sense to distinguish between a purchase and a robbery. And therefore, it cannot be that the machloket between these Amoraim, these Tanaim, is only where he swore. And furthermore, another similar challenge, בא לפני רבי עקיבא ואמר לו אין לך תקנה עד שתשלם לכל אחד ואחד ויסלק דעתך דמשתבע חסיד מי משתבע בשקרה. Furthermore, Rava challenges it because it was a story of a certain pious individual who bought something from one of 2 people, but he doesn't remember who he bought it from. He says, what am I going to do? I want to pay, but I don't know who I bought it from. So he comes to Bitarfon, and Bitarfon says, just take the money that you owe for the purchase and put it between them, and then leave, and then they'll figure it out. He came to Rabbi Akiva, asked the same question. He says, no, you have to pay each and every one of them in full. Now, if you think it's talking about a case where he swore falsely, He's talking about a pious individual. Would a pious individual swear falsely and say, "Oh, I paid already. I don't owe anybody anything"? It doesn't make sense. So it therefore must be that he did not swear falsely, and yet they still have a machloket, even though they did not swear falsely. And maybe you'll say, oh, maybe this case where of a Baal Teshuvah, he swore falsely beforehand, before he made Teshuvah. We're calling him a Chassid now because now he made Teshuvah since then. But that can't be, because we can identify who this Chassid was. Or Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, or Rabbi Yehuda ben Eli, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, Rabbi Yehuda ben Eli, Chasidim be'edemi karahavu. And we have a statement that anytime it says a certain pious person, it's either one of these two sages, and both of them were always pious. They weren't Baalei Teshuvah. And therefore, it cannot possibly be that this story is talking about a case where they swore falsely, but rather the machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon applies even whether or not they swore falsely, and therefore neither of them could be an author of the Mishnah, because we made an inference from the Mishnah that one has to go and pay no matter, even into Madai, only where he swore falsely, but not if he didn't swear falsely. So now we go back to the drawing board to see who is the author of our Mishnah. Ela le'olam, Rabbi Tarfon hi. Model Rabbi Tarfon hechad ishteva. Mai tamad amar kerala sher hu lo yitenenu beyom ashmato. In fact, the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon said that you can just leave the money here and let them fight over it and get it. You just have to deposit the money anywhere. Rabbi Tarfon only said that where he did not swear falsely. But even Rabbi Tarfon would agree that you have to pay directly to each and every person, and you'd have to go far away and pay him directly if he did swear. And so he's the author of our Mishnah as well, that says you have to pay far away if he swore. And what's the Rabbi Tarfon's source? From the pasuk, same pasuk as I said before, whoever you stole it from, you have to give it to him. Yitenenu lo. That means you have to give it in his hand. Now, Rabbi Akiva, who disagrees with that, he says that Rabbi Akiva damar afagav de la mishteba kanis. Rabbi Akiva says, I agree with your pasuk, and that pasuk shows that if you swear falsely, you have to give it to each and every person, and you have to go to Madai, you have to put it in his hand. But I think that the rabbis made a special takana, they made a kanas, and said, not only are we going to apply that to someone who swore falsely, even if you didn't swear, but you still have to pay it directly into his hands. And that's Rabbi Akiva's position. So now the Mishnah can be the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon, Michdi hecha de mishteba, la sagya de lo hoda, mai irya v'nishba, afilu belo shivoa name, ditanya, model Rabbi Tarfon, b'amel l'shnayim, gazalti echad mikem, mane, ve'ene yodea eze mikem, noten laze mane ve'laze mane, shekevad hoda mepi asmo. Now we have a problem with the identification of Rabbi Tarfon as well, because according to the Rabbi Tarfon, a robber only has to pay the fifth and bring a korban, where not only did he swore falsely, but also that he admitted to the fact. He has to admit to the fact himself, and therefore, since he also has to admit, even if he didn't swear falsely, but came and admitted that he stole, he would also have to give it to the guy in his hand. So therefore, according to Rabbi Tarfon, there is a case where even if you didn't swear falsely, you still have to go and send it to Madai and give it in his hand in a case where he admitted. Where do we see that Rabbi Tarfon thinks that? In the following Braita, that Rabbi Tarfon says admits, where one robber says to one of two people, listen, I'm coming to admit, I stole from one of you, but I don't know which one of you it is. Then Rabbi Tarfon agrees to Rabbi Akiva that he has to give both of them the full payment because he admitted to them, and he has to do this even if he doesn't swear. And therefore, our Mishnah, from which we inferred that you only have to go to Madai if you swore, but not otherwise if you didn't swear, cannot be Rabbi Tarfon either, because Rabbi Tarfon would say you have to give it directly in his hands to each victim or go to Madai as long as you admitted. that you did it, even if you didn't swear. So now it can't be to be Akiva, and it can't be to be Tarfon. What are we going to do? Is the author of our Mishnah, Ela Marava, Shane Matitin Dechevan de Yada Leman Gezale Ve'odi Le Kevan Defshar Lahadure Mamona Lemare Havale Keman Amar Le Yuli Biadecha Hilkach Nishba אף אגב דקאמר ליולי בידך, כיוון דבאי כפרה, להסגיד עד דמטה לידה. להשתבע, הווה גבי פיקדון עד דעתה ושקיל ל. Rava says, in fact, our Mishnah can be both Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. They only have their machloket in a case where a guy, the robber, doesn't know who he stole from, and so that's where the machloket, does he just deposit it according to Bitafon, or does he pay each of them according to the Akiva? But our Mishnah is a different case. In our Mishnah, he knows precisely who he stole it from, so since he knows exactly who he stole it from, and it's possible for him to return the money to its proper owner. So this is similar to a case of someone who deposits something. Here it's the victim who we're treating it as if he deposited the stolen item in the hands of the robber. And so generally, he says, listen, you came, now we know it's you, you're the robber, you're holding on to my item, hold on to it until I come and get it. So in general, you can do that. But here, because he also swore falsely, even though the proper owner said, keep it there as a custodian, and I'll come and get it eventually. From the victim's point of view, that's sufficient. But if the robber wants atonement, then the robber himself, for his own sake, is going to have to return it into the hands of the victim, so that then he can bring the korban and get atonement. That's why when he swears falsely, he has to go to the ends of the earth and pay whatever he has to in order to put it in his hands. But if he didn't swear falsely, then he doesn't need that kaparat. He doesn't have to bring a korban. And therefore, as long as he informs the victim, listen, I stole from you, I have your item, I'm ready and willing to return it anytime, then he can keep it, and he's watching it for the victim, and he doesn't have to put it in the hands directly, because he doesn't need atonement for the swear, and he can wait until the victim comes and takes it from him. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.